You open the fridge and grab a familiar cold can of Coca-Cola. Red label, classic taste, a very American feeling, but you might be mistaken. In 2025, that can was produced in Brampton, Ontario, not Atlanta. And it's not just Coca-Cola. Ford cars, Tesla batteries, Heinz ketchup, even the blender in your kitchen are quietly moving their homes to Canada. Why? This isn't a political story. This is an economic story, and it's unfolding right under your nose. The quiet departure of icons. No alarm bells, no congressional debates, no tweet big enough to stir a storm. Yet, on an ordinary day in 2025, Americans began drinking Coca-Cola canned in Canada, driving Ford Super Duty trucks assembled in Ontario, eating Heinz ketchup bottled in Leamington, and turning on blenders made in Mississauga. No one truly gave advance notice, but something quietly left America. Not just jobs or production lines, but that subtle sense of pride when seeing a familiar product labeled Made in USA. Something is changing. Not loudly, not sensationally, but enough to make us pause and ask, are the things we thought were ours still truly made by American hands? For over a century, the United States hasn't just been the world's largest consumer nation, but the cradle of global manufacturing icons. A can of Coca-Cola once represented American industry, efficiency, trust, and the ability to reach every convenience store and dinner table across the globe. A Ford wasn't just a vehicle, but an identity. A bottle of Heinz ketchup wasn't merely a condiment, but a legacy tied to family meals, from weekend football games to summer barbecues. But what happens when those icons are no longer made on American soil? Make no mistake, this isn't the story of factories relocating to Asia to save on labor costs. The story of 2025 is subtler, more familiar, and right next door. It's when Coca-Cola's canning line moved to Brampton, Ontario, not because labor was cheaper, but because the U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on imported aluminum, causing can production costs to soar. It's when Canada, with cheap hydroelectricity, no aluminum tariffs, and open trade policies, became the perfect destination for companies still wanting to serve the U.S. market. Just not from U.S. soil anymore. This didn't happen overnight. It's the result of dozens of patchwork policies, from trade wars to energy instability, from delayed permits to labor strikes. While Washington wrestled with endless political cycles, Ottawa quietly signed manufacturing support packages, cut regulatory barriers, and secured clean energy resources. And so, one day, trucks began rolling out of the Coca-Cola plant in Brampton, crossing the border unnoticed, carrying millions of cans into New York, Michigan, and Ohio. No banners saying, "We're moving." No historic press release. Just absence. The silence of can stamping machines in Pittsburgh. The missing night shifts in Fremont. The fading sense of, "We built this." What makes this change dangerous is its silence, because consumers don't feel it. The can is still cold, the label still red, the taste still familiar, but inside, the supply chain has been reshaped. Places that once stood as pillars of American industry are now being replaced by new industrial centers lining Ontario's Highway 401. And no one is openly talking about it. If this were only about a can of Coca-Cola, perhaps no one would care. But it's not just a soda can. It's the first signal, a quiet warning that Made in USA no longer necessarily means manufactured in America. It raises a bigger question. If even the most familiar industrial icons are leaving, what can still preserve America's manufacturing identity? No one is stealing the U.S. supply chain. Canada didn't snatch Coca-Cola, Ford, or Heinz. They simply made a better offer. And in the global economy of 2025, corporations aren't loyal to geography. They're loyal to math. A can of soda may not trigger a crisis, but if you start checking the labels in your fridge, your kitchen, and your garage, you might realize many things that used to be very American now carry a Canadian passport. And that, if left unrecognized, could be the first chapter of a story America never wanted to write. Borderless numbers. You can be patriotic, but supply chains are not. And if the first point revealed how Made in USA icons quietly crossed the border, the more important story lies in the second point: why they did. It's not because Canadians work for lower wages. They don't. Average wages in Ontario's factories are on par with, sometimes even higher than, those in U.S. industrial states like Michigan or Ohio. This isn't the familiar story of offshoring to Asia. It's a far subtler version. American companies are following the logic of economics, a cold, emotionless, and borderless logic. Let's start with the invisible, but essential, ingredient in every factory: energy. In 2025, the U.S. faces a dual headache: rising electricity prices and a shortage of transmission infrastructure. In California, Texas, or even New England, manufacturing companies are paying 1.5 to 2 times more for power than their rivals in Quebec or Ontario. Meanwhile, Canada, thanks to its massive and stable hydroelectric system, provides clean, cheap, and non-volatile electricity. This not only lowers costs, but also earns big ESG points with global investors. Next is tariffs. When the U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on imported aluminum to protect its domestic smelting industry, it also inadvertently forced domestic companies making soda cans, car frames, and packaging shells to shoulder billions in additional costs. Meanwhile, Canada, unburdened by this tax policy, became the ideal place to set up production lines while still selling into the U.S. through the USMCA, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, without added input or export tariffs. So, if you're a CFO running a multi-billion-dollar corporation, what would you choose? A factory in Ohio paying high electricity rates, facing a skilled labor shortage, and importing taxed aluminum? Or a facility in Quebec, where everything, from energy to raw materials to permitting, is simply easier? CEOs aren't leaving America out of resentment. They're leaving because of an Excel sheet. In that spreadsheet, numbers don't recognize borders. They only recognize efficiency. They calculate every cent per unit, and they show Canada is not a backup land. It is the new manufacturing hub of North America. The Tesla story is proof. Everyone thinks Tesla is a tech symbol of the U.S., and it is, by brand. But when it comes to the core of an electric car, the 4,680 lithium battery, most of those are now being produced in Quebec. Why? Because there, the Canadian government is willing to invest over $1.2 billion just to attract Elon Musk's production line. Because there, factory permits take months, not years like in Texas or Nevada. Because there are no prolonged labor strikes, no massive operational costs during heat waves. This isn't risk-based relocation. This is optimization-based redefinition. We're living in an era where speed matters more than slogans, cost matters more than borders, and stability matters more than tradition. Big corporations no longer behave like national citizens. They act like explorers on a map of global efficiency. They go where resources are cheaper, labor is skilled, and, most importantly, policy is predictable, even if it's just a few hundred miles across the border. As this unfolds quietly, consumers see nothing wrong. But American manufacturing is slowly being left behind in a game it once led. In the small towns that were once proud industrial hubs, home to soup, ketchup, or auto part factories, there are now quiet streets, shuttered stores, and for lease signs hanging silently on old warehouses. People there don't need financial reports to feel what has changed. In the end, this isn't a mass exodus from America. It's a race toward efficiency, and Canada is proving faster. Not because they're doing more, but because they know exactly what to do to attract the right players. And in this game, the one who calculates faster manufactures more. No national flag needs to be printed on the product. Just the right number in the top right corner of the spreadsheet. Northern Resurrection. When a nation gradually loses what once defined its industrial identity, the question isn't just, what have we lost? But also, who picked it up and what did they do with it? And in 2025, the answer, increasingly clear, is Canada. If the previous section showed why American corporations are drifting north in search of a more efficient environment, then Section 3 tells how Canada is not merely a host, but is actively reviving what America has lost. Not just factories, but a strategic new manufacturing ecosystem. You might call it Canada's reindustrialization. But unlike the Bring Manufacturing Back to America dream, which has repeatedly bogged down in politics, strikes, and overlapping tariffs, in Canada, everything happens quietly, swiftly, and with precision. Take the Heinz ketchup example. Leamington, Ontario, a small town once known as Canada's tomato capital, had Heinz pull out in 2014. That was when global production got swept into the cyclone of globalization, low-cost pressure, and ruthless efficiency. The plant shut down. The town crashed. It was called the end of an icon. But then, in 2020, in a move rarely publicized by the media, Heinz came back to Leamington. And by 2025, what looked like a rescue had become a key link in the North American ketchup supply chain. Over 60% of the Heinz ketchup sold in the U.S. is now bottled there, right where it was once abandoned. Not out of sentiment, not out of atonement, but because Leamington was now different. Ontario learned to provide not only land and labor, but business confidence. From farm to bottle, everything runs smoothly. Tomatoes abundant, water stable, logistics optimized, and most importantly, no unusual political disruptions that can halt the production line overnight. Meanwhile, California, once the largest tomato-growing region in the U.S., struggles with drought, irrigation limits, soaring labor costs, and fractured supply chains. And Pennsylvania, the old Heinz home, now faces rising input costs, making those plants obsolete even as the brand still resonates. Heinz didn't leave due to losses. They left because Leamington became the right place to stay. What's interesting is that Canada's revival doesn't follow China's massive, noisy industrial model. They didn't build mega-industrial zones with hundreds of thousands of workers. They built lean value chains, clean, highly digitized, and resilient. A small town like Leamington can operate as a North American ketchup center, not because it's huge, but because it operates flawlessly. The same dynamic repeats in other places. In Brampton with Coca-Cola, in Oakville with Ford, in Beckwith with EV components. It's not that Canada has something inherently superior, but that they don't break things that should work well. When Americans talk about a manufacturing city, they often refer to a bygone era of glory. When Canadians speak of it, they talk about a present that's accelerating. They don't boast. They don't speak at national summits. But thousands of containers still quietly leave Toronto each week, carrying ketchup, batteries, EV parts, and appliances, all heading south to conquer the U.S. market with the silence of efficiency. The question is no longer, why did American industrial towns fall silent? But, why did Canada choose this moment to speak up? When Heinz returned to Leamington, it wasn't just a reopened factory. It was a strategy to reclaim the trust of global corporations. And Canada is doing this not with slogans, but with results. They didn't say, build back better. They simply said, build smarter. And in 2025, that is reshaping the manufacturing map of an entire continent. The new bargaining at the border. If you stand at the Windsor border crossing, where Detroit connects with Ontario via the Ambassador Bridge, and look in both directions, you'll see two worlds moving in opposite directions. On one side, Detroit, once the symbol of American industry, is still struggling to reclaim its former glory, surrounded by tariff policies, labor disputes, and never-ending strikes. On the other side, Windsor, quiet and often overlooked, is rising to become a strategic gateway for a new manufacturing order. And right at this intersection, a new kind of bargaining is taking shape. Not through threats, but through efficiency. Not through soft power, but through hard logic. After Canada proved it could run a modern, flexible, low-conflict supply chain, a wave of American corporations, from electronics and consumer goods to EV technology, started changing their negotiation stance. They no longer said, "We're here to expand." They said, "We need Canada to survive in the new global market." And with that, Canada was no longer the one taking orders. They set the terms. They filtered. They negotiated. Ontario's government required EV plants to invest in local skill infrastructure. Not just creating jobs, but transferring technology. Quebec set strict environmental standards for new logistics centers, requiring renewable energy use and near-total recycling. Alberta, once a fortress of oil and gas, is also pivoting. They asked lithium battery firms to simultaneously invest in winter energy storage research, a unique challenge of cold climates, and surprisingly, corporations agreed. Not because they were forced, but because they understood that if they wanted what Canada now offered, stability, efficiency, risk management, this was the price to pay. The way Canada sets conditions is quiet. They don't bully like China, don't bargain like India, don't use hidden incentives like some Southeast Asian nations. They do it with the posture of a country that knows its worth and knows when to say no. A clear example is the deal between Magna International, Canada, and General Motors, USA, in mid-2025. GM wanted to expand EV drivetrain production in Ontario, but Magna refused unless GM committed to investing in a domestic Canadian solid-state battery ecosystem. In the end, GM conceded, not because it was cornered, but because it realized this was the only place in North America that could guarantee delivery schedules under 3 weeks, free from strikes, floods, or policy whiplash. That wasn't just a deal. It was the clearest sign that bargaining power had shifted, where Canada, for the first time in decades, wasn't waiting in line for a share, but was dealing the cards. And in that game, they don't play fast, but solid. Not loud, but deep. And above all, they don't aim to win by making others lose. They aim for mutual gain, but under new rules. The rules of stability, sustainability, and sovereignty in the value chain. The border is no longer a dividing line. It's where two models meet, one fading in internal conflict, one growing in quiet autonomy. And this time, the rising side is no longer the United States. The proactive stance on new bridges. People often say that geography is destiny, but in the summer of 2025, Canada proved the opposite. Destiny does not lie at the border, but in how you use it. For over a century, the Canada-US border was seen as a line of dependence. 75% of Canada's exports used to head south, on overnight trains and container trucks lining up at each checkpoint. But when trade shocks, strikes, and tariffs from Washington made traditional flows shaky, Ottawa chose a path few expected: building bridges, both literally and figuratively. In British Columbia, the first export bridge to Asia, named Gateway to Resilience, a port intermodal complex, was quietly inaugurated in April. From then on, Canadian lumber no longer had to go through transshipment in California to reach Japan. Instead, it travels directly on a new line linking Prince Rupert, Osaka, Busan. This is not just infrastructure. This is a declaration. Canada does not wait for someone else's gateways. They build their own. In the east, a new maritime corridor from Halifax to Morocco has quietly come into operation, connecting Quebec's high-tech products with the African market, where demand for medical equipment, educational software, and automated machinery is soaring. Not loud like China's Belt and Road, not tense like EU negotiations. Canada does it with a very different weapon: reliability. And even in the Midwest, once the backyard of American industry, a series of new rail lines linking Manitoba with northern Mexican states have begun operating, turning Canada into a multi-hub transit point, instead of a passive endpoint as before. Infrastructure is the surface, but deeper, what Canada is building is a network of soft influence, not based on military power, not on geopolitical voice, but on something simple. Whoever can maintain an unbroken supply chain will be the one coordinating the new global game. And with every bridge, every new port, every transport corridor Canada proactively opens, they're gradually shifting from the role of America's trading partner to an independent player in the structure of global commerce. They no longer go through the U.S. to reach the world. They go directly. That doesn't just change economics. It changes how people see Canada. From international investors to regional governments, from business associations to standards organizations. All are beginning to redefine Canada not as an extension of the U.S. economy, but as a new anchor point with its own logic, its own conditions, and its own capacity to negotiate on equal footing. We are witnessing something unprecedented. Canada is not just expanding the trade map. They are shrinking dependence. And that, in a post-pandemic world full of instability, disruption, and restructuring, is the most sustainable form of power a nation can possess. The power to redraw its own map. The transformation of a once-forgotten name. There was once something that made international analysts raise an eyebrow when talking about Canada. Too quiet, too gentle, too stable to lead anything in a world full of upheaval. But that very stability turned out to be the one thing that didn't collapse amid successive global crises. As major economies spun in inflation and the politicization of trade, as supply chains were choked by geopolitical calculations, Canada, with its quiet reliability, became the place the world turned its gaze back to. Not as a replacement superpower, but as a center of balance where trade logic was placed above political emotion. And at that moment, an invisible asset of Canada began to reveal its value: national brand. No one had really named it before. Canada used to be just the place next to America, the safe haven for investment when everything else was unstable, the mild-mannered friend in the G7. But in 2025, as the United States sank deep into multi-layered trade disputes with China, Mexico, even Europe, and as constant pivoting from the White House exhausted global partners, Canada, by not changing itself too quickly, became the fixed point in a spinning world. Coca-Cola moved part of its bottling production chain to Ontario instead of expanding in Georgia. Toyota increased capacity in British Columbia to avoid risks at the U.S.-Mexico border. Taiwanese chipmakers like TSMC set up maintenance centers in Alberta, a small move but one of great significance, as it chose a land untouched by the U.S.-China Silicon War. Canada doesn't compete with anyone, but it's no longer standing on the sidelines. That positive neutrality isn't avoidance, it's strategy. Ottawa understands that in the geopolitical game, speaking less, doing right, gives partners more reassurance than bold speeches. Because in an era where tweets can reverse policy overnight, a nation that keeps its promises becomes a rare commodity. Experts call this silent strength, a power not drawn from attention-seeking, but from never causing others to lose trust. And now it has become a true strategic asset. On supply chain resilience rankings, Canada surpasses even Germany and Japan. In new bilateral agreements with South Africa, Indonesia, and Brazil, the words stable and reliable are mentioned more often than competitive pricing. And in international business conferences, CEOs are beginning to say something very different to each other. Let's consider Canada. This is not a flashy revolution. It's a quiet but profound reshaping, where a country once seen as a side map is gradually rewriting its central position on the global trade board, not with power, but with value. And the paradox, yet utterly convincing truth, is precisely because it doesn't shout. Canada is now being heard more clearly than ever before, when the giants silently nod. People often think of economic shifts as chess games between governments. Negotiations, tariffs, declarations, and counter-declarations. But in the world of 2025, it's the names that don't give speeches, don't argue on television, don't sign executive orders. That are the real main characters. They are Apple, Siemens, Samsung, ExxonMobil, Nestlé, BP, and hundreds of other corporations. Giants commanding trillions of dollars in global supply chains. And they've just nodded to Canada. Not because Canada is cheaper, and not because the country has a bustling labor force like Southeast Asia, or a massive domestic market like China. They nodded for three short words now more valuable than gold: lower risk. In an age where a single tweet can wipe out $20 billion in market value, a court can overturn entire industrial policies, and an election can rewrite the rules of the game. What global businesses need is not a promise, but a predictable environment. And Canada, by consistently honoring its commitments, respecting international law, avoiding the politicization of trade, and building a coherent investment ecosystem, has become the safe haven corporations can rely on to redesign their global networks. A quiet but unmistakable shift is underway. Logistics routes from Prince Rupert Port are expanding. Transcontinental rail lines from Vancouver to Toronto are no longer just serving the domestic market, but are becoming the backbone of a new North American distribution network, where many companies choose to store, process, and assemble in Canada before shipping into the U.S., to avoid increasingly unpredictable tariff barriers. And it's not just physical goods. Data centers, AI labs, cloud platforms, the digital world's core, are also pouring in. Montreal, Waterloo, and Calgary are gradually becoming tech satellites that global firms like Google, NVIDIA, and Oracle choose to reduce risk, instead of concentrating everything in Silicon Valley or Austin. For the first time in decades, Canada is not just a contract manufacturer, but a place where strategic decisions are made. What's remarkable is, Canada isn't luring investors with budget-crushing tax incentives like some nations. It's not cutting corners on environmental or labor standards to attract capital. It's not playing nice in public and ambushing in private, like some countries have done to tech firms. It simply says, here's the law. It won't change overnight. This is how we operate. See if it works for you. And it turns out, in an era of turmoil, that blunt honesty is the most appealing invitation. When the world no longer trusts anyone, the one who promises nothing becomes the most trustworthy. Canada doesn't aim to become the new global hub. It simply aims to be an indispensable part of the long-term strategy for those who want to survive the chaos. And that pragmatic humility, paired with infrastructure capability, political stability, and unique geography, is creating a new model, the trust economy. When the giants quietly shift their investment maps, without loud statements but just move factories, build warehouses, sign contracts, and open offices in Toronto instead of Texas, in Halifax instead of Los Angeles. That's when the world truly shifts, not through words, but through actions. And if history once celebrated nations for revolutions or conquests, then for Canada, this is the moment a nation earns a central role. By not making itself the center of attention,